There are stories hidden in the folds of history stories you were never supposed to hear, not because they're false, but because they're true. In 1834, deep in the forgotten hollows of eastern Kentucky, two little girls arrived with their father at a church no longer standing, its wood long rotted, its stone foundation eaten by time. What happened in the 72 hours that followed was buried, silenced by guilt, masked by scripture, and swallowed by generations too terrified to speak. But they wrote it down. Not for the public, for penance. And the journal was never supposed to be found. The Morrison twins, Rebecca and Rachel, were only 9 years old when they walked into Pine Hollow, a town so remote it barely existed on maps. What they revealed shattered the community, fractured its faith, and left behind whispers that still haunt the trees. They didn't come with magic. They didn't chant spells or call down spirits. They simply knew things. Things no child or adult should know. They exposed secrets buried for decades. Name the hidden sins of every man and woman in that congregation, not with anger, not even with judgment. Just truth, pure, brutal, undeniable. By the time they left, the town was never the same again. And neither was Pastor William Phillips, whose journal became the last known record of what really happened during those 3 days. But this isn't just a ghost story. This is about how truth unravels control, how knowledge destroys obedience. You're not here to be entertained. You're here because part of you is ready to remember the forbidden things men in robes and governments in silence have tried to bury. And if you're still here after what I'm about to show you, then there's no going back. The church. The blood. The dreams. We begin at the moment most men break. The moment a child names the secret you thought died with you. Now listen closely. And do not look away. The hills of Kentucky don't forget, they just grow quiet. And in that quiet, things fester. November 5th, 10th, 1834, the Morrisons arrived at dusk, the sky bleeding orange as the sun fell behind the Cumberland ridges. Reverend Ezekiel Morrison walked with a limp earned from miles of wilderness preaching. His coat was threadbare, his boots cracked and caked with mud. But it wasn't him that people stared at, it was the twins, Rebecca and Rachel. Identical in face but not in presence. One smiled too easily, the other not at all. The first time Pastor Phillips laid eyes on them, he said their eyes held the silence of old tombs. That's how he phrased it in the journal, and he never used poetic language. The town of Pine Hollow, population 207, was built around a single doctrine: obedience. Obedience to God, obedience to men who claimed to speak for Him. Every home, every life bent around that small wooden church like roots around a gravestone. And it was that church where the first wound was cut open, the night of their arrival. During a simple supper, Rebecca casually asked the pastor's wife if the roses by the eastern fence had survived the blight. A disease no one had spoken of in years, one that had destroyed the woman's pride and joy. Her garden, the last summer her mother was alive, Rebecca couldn't have known, but she did. Rachel said nothing. She simply watched her sister speak, as if hearing the words before they were said. That's how they always moved, like two halves of the same mind, one dreaming, the other remembering. The next morning, Rebecca told Pastor Phillips about the whiskey hidden under the church floorboards. She told him what it was wrapped in. The blanket he'd used to swaddle his dead infant son. No one knew about it. No one. Not even his wife. Rachel named the child. This is the point most men begin to break. The moment you realize your thoughts, your sins, your most private agonies are no longer yours. Understand this. It wasn't witchcraft. It wasn't demonic. It was clarity. Pure, unfiltered access to a realm of perception we've been trained to deny. Science would later call it impossible. Religion would call it blasphemy. But to the twins, it was just truth. Simple, inevitable, and the truth has never been safe. They say children lie. But what happens when the lies are the only thing that protects you from the truth? Sunday came, as it always did in Pine Hollow, with the cold wind of November scraping across weathered cabins. The congregation gathered, clothed in modesty and silence. No one yet dared to speak of what had happened the night before about the whiskey, the roses, the look on Pastor Phillips' face when the blanket was named. Ezekiel preached that morning, fire and ash. He spoke of judgment, of hidden sins rotting the foundation of God's house. His voice echoed like thunder through the rafters. But it was not his sermon that the congregation would remember, it was what came after. Rebecca approached Samuel Turner, a man whose name was etched into the walls of that church, whose money kept its roof from collapsing. She looked up at him, innocent and calm, and said, "It's not stealing if you put it back. Mr. Turner, Papa says God forgives those who repent." Turner's face turned white. He staggered. He had been embezzling funds for months, quietly skimming from the plate to pay debts he swore he would someday return. No one knew, not even his wife. Rachel walked to Martha Whitfield, the oldest woman in the room, the moral compass of Pine Hollow, and whispered, "Your husband isn't dead, is he? That's why you keep the letters under your sewing chest." Martha's mouth fell open, trembling. Her husband had abandoned her. The lie of his death was her armor. The letters, hidden for over a decade, were her shame. They didn't stop Dr. Hayes, the Millers. Young Thomas Brett, one by one the twins called out secrets like reading pages from a book only they could see. Each truth was delivered without malice, without ceremony, as if naming the wind, or pointing out the color of the sky. But in that room, silence became terror. Because every man, every woman felt the walls closing in, no one was clean. Not in Pine Hollow. And now, every secret was exposed. Do you understand? This wasn't a performance. It was a reckoning. These children weren't speaking for God. They were speaking for something older, something that remembers everything, and for the first time, the people of Pine Hollow realized they were not alone inside that church. The church fell silent in a way no structure should. It wasn't the stillness of peace. It was the quiet that follows a scream, buried alive. Rebecca stood at the altar, her small hand resting on the wooden cross like she'd touched it before. Not in this life, but in another. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't rise, it cut. "This is sacred ground," she said. "But it's been stained by what happened here before." And then the name that Pine Hollow had buried under. 16 years of prayer and silence was spoken aloud for the first time. The Whitman family didn't die in a house fire, did they, Pastor Phillips? They died right here, in this room. And some of you know exactly why. Gasps, choked sobs. And one long, eerie pause, the kind of silence that tastes like metal. In your mouth, Pastor Phillips gripped the edge of the pulpit. The journal would later describe the moment as a collapse of reality. Because he knew, everyone over a certain age knew. In 1818, the Whitmans had been Pine Hollow's first family. Jacob, the blacksmith, Mary, the healer, and their daughters, Hope and Faith, twin girls with bright eyes and voices like birdsong. The official story said their cabin caught fire during a storm. Nothing left but ashes and bones, but there were holes in the tale, even back then. Why no one heard them scream? Why their bodies were buried so quickly? Why Mary's herbs were confiscated and burned? Rebecca spoke again. Faith had a birthmark on her left shoulder. Hope had one on her ankle. Faith was wearing her blue dress when she died. Hope had a fever. She was in her nightgown. No child could have known that, but Rachel added something colder, something final. They came to the church for safety. They were hiding, but they were found. What followed was chaos barely contained. Elder Thompson stood, trembling, his eyes hollow. His wife clutched his arm, weeping. Others rose slowly, as if dragged to their feet by invisible chains. You must understand. This wasn't about ghosts. This was about memory. About what happens when the illusion of righteousness fractures and the rot beneath is revealed. And the Morrison twins? They weren't tormenting these people. They were waking them up. The lies we tell are bricks. Stack enough of them and they become walls strong enough to keep truth out or to trap guilt inside. The Whitman family had been the heart of Pine Hollow in 1818. They were kind, skilled, godly, or so everyone said. But when things began to change, when Mary's remedies healed faster than the local doctors, when her daughters began singing songs no one had taught them, people grew afraid, not openly. Not all at once, but fear doesn't need a reason when You live in isolation. It only needs a whisper. Rebecca and Rachel weren't asking questions that Sunday. They were declaring judgment. And it was judgment that couldn't be escaped because the town had killed the Whitmans, not with fire, with silence, with complicity. They'd come to the church for sanctuary, Mary carrying one daughter, Jacob the other. Someone had followed. Someone had locked the door behind them. And someone had stood there while the screams faded. But someone wasn't just one person. It was the town. The congregation had known. At least some of them. The pastor at the time had covered it up. Claimed it was God's will. The others? They learned quickly that truth was dangerous. That survival meant forgetting. That piety could be worn like armor even over a body soaked in guilt. But guilt doesn't rot. It ferments. And time doesn't cleanse it. It makes it stronger. Rachel stood beside her sister, hands clasped in front of her like a mournful doll. Her eyes scanned the crowd as if reading a ledger. Some of you left flowers where there's no grave. You remember even if you don't speak. And then, quietly, she said, they remember too. That single sentence caused Samuel Turner to vomit behind the pews. Mrs. Carter fainted. And Pastor Phillips, strong, educated, devout, fell to his knees. Because he remembered something too. A sound he once heard while repairing the floorboards near the altar, a soft knock from beneath. One he convinced himself was imagination. It wasn't. This is the line you must understand. The one crossed without fanfare. This wasn't a haunting. It was a reckoning. And the twins? They were not here to ask for forgiveness. They were here to deliver balance. What if the dead don't want justice? What if they want witnesses? When the Morrison twins revealed the truth about the Whitmans, Pine Hollow didn't fall apart. It collapsed inward like a structure hollowed by rot. Not with screams, but with shame. The kind of shame that eats through bone. Elder Thompson, oldest living member of the original settlers, finally spoke. His voice cracked, not from age, but from the weight of memory. There was no fire, he said. They died here, in this room. He said the words as if vomiting poison he'd swallowed every day for 16 years. The truth poured out in pieces, the night of the killings, the false funeral, the orders to bury the bodies within the church's foundation during its expansion. To purify the ground, they said. To keep their spirits from wandering. But you can't bury betrayal in consecrated earth and expect it to stay quiet. Rebecca looked at Thompson with eyes that weren't angry. Just sad. They sang songs in dreams, she whispered. They still do, but now the songs have no words. And then Dr. Hayes, the town's medical man already shaken by his own exposure, stepped forward, his face pale as parchment. When we repaired the eastern wall, 3 years ago, we found bone fragments, small, too small. He hadn't told anyone. He couldn't, but he knew. And now, the entire room knew. The Whitman children had been walled into the church like bricks in a foundation, buried beneath sermons and hymns. Their only sin, being different. Their only crime, being seen as unnatural. And in a town ruled by fear, disguised as faith, that was enough. The room smelled of old wood, sweat, and fear. Rachel turned slowly and faced the altar. This place was supposed to be holy, she said, but it was made of lies, lies and ash. And then the lights dimmed not from any candle going out, but from something older, something underneath. The journal notes that the air changed in that moment, grew heavy, almost electric. Several townspeople claimed they heard voices faint, melodic, like the remnants of a hymn sung in reverse, but the twins didn't flinch because they had heard it before. This was not their first reckoning, and it wouldn't be their last. It began with a sound no one could place, low, rhythmic, like breath echoing through a hollowed tree. Some swore it was whine through the boards. Others, those with more fear than faith, said it was singing, but only the twins understood it. Rachel tilted her head, eyes half-lidded, lips parted as if listening to a familiar voice speaking from beneath the floor. Rebecca gripped the pew in front of her and whispered something inaudible, one word, repeated like a chant. The room was paralyzed. Pastor Phillips, kneeling by the altar, could feel the wood under his hands grow cold. Not cold like weather, but cold like absence. as if heat itself had recoiled from the truth now exhumed. Then Rachel spoke, and her voice was not her own. "You buried the body," she said, "but not the memory. Memory does not rot." The voice came not from her throat, but from within the space itself. Echoed, multiplied, deepened. Her lips moved slowly, unnaturally. Rebecca stood beside her, tears in her eyes, but not fear. Sorrow, that moment, Pastor Phillips later wrote, was when he stopped believing in God as he knew him, because what stood before him wasn't possession. It was communion. The spirit echo of Faith Whitman had fused with Rachel, not to torment, but to speak. To be heard after 16 years of silence, she spoke of fire, but not literal, the fire of betrayal. The moment she and her sister hid behind the altar, clutching each other as townsfolk argued in whispers, some calling them witches, others demanding proof, none stepping forward to defend. And then silence followed by blows. Then nothing. She remembered the sound of her mother screaming as she was dragged outside. She remembered who closed the church doors. Now, with breath that did not belong to the living, she named them. 3 men. 1 woman, all still alive. The names hung in the air like nooses. Samuel Turner, Elder Thompson, Judith Whitfield, Isaiah Miller. Gasps, screams. Judith collapsed. Miller began reciting scripture in a trembling voice, as if trying to drown out the sound of his own name. But scripture doesn't cleanse blood, and names, once spoken aloud, can never be taken back. The dead had spoken, and the living had nowhere left to hide. Still with me? There's a moment right after the truth is spoken when time fractures, no one moves, no one breathes. It's not shock. It's something deeper. It's recognition. The 4 names Rebecca and Rachel revealed hung in the air like a hex. Each syllable a key, unlocking doors that had remained sealed for 16 years. And behind those doors, shame, complicity, silence. Samuel Turner stumbled back, knocking over a pew. His face twisted, not in denial but in collapse. His wealth, his influence, none of it mattered now. The room no longer saw him as a pillar. It saw him as a coward. Judith Whitfield didn't speak. Her hands clenched her dress so tightly her knuckles split. Pastor Phillips noticed it, how she shook, not with fear, but with something older. Remorse that had calcified into bitterness. Elder Thompson tried to explain. He raised a trembling hand and started speaking of context and fear and the devil's deceit, but no one was listening, because the Morrison twins were watching him, not with hate but with pity. "You didn't strike the blow," Rebecca said. "But you nodded your head," Rachel added. "And that's all it took." The congregation began to unravel. Mrs. Carter sobbed uncontrollably. Dr. Hayes sat down and stared at his hands like they belonged to someone else. The younger families, the ones who hadn't been born during the Whitman betrayal, looked to the elders with fresh disgust. A line had been drawn, not between past and present, but between truth and illusion, and the illusion was shattering. Pastor Philip stood weakly. His face was pale, but his voice didn't waver. "Why now?" he asked the twins. "Why here? Why bring this darkness into the light?" Rebecca looked at him, no smile, no mockery. "Because this place was built on a lie. And lies rot foundations. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't supernatural horror. It was correction." Rachel stepped toward the altar. Her feet were bare now. When had she removed her shoes? No one remembered, but each step echoed. Not on wood, but in memory. She knelt, placed her palm against the floorboards, and whispered, "You can rest now. They finally see." And the church groaned. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. The entire structure let out a sound like a ship straining against waves, because when truth is exhumed, the earth shifts. The groan of the church beams wasn't the sound of collapse. Not yet. It was the sound of release. Old wood, dry air, a century of breathless silence finally exhaled. Every soul in that sanctuary felt it, not with their ears but in their bones. A trembling deep in the marrow that said, "Something old has been watching, and now it moves." Rachel's hands still rested on the floorboards. Her eyes were closed, and she began to hum a lullaby, the kind no child should know, the kind no living person had sung in Pine Hollow since 1818. Pastor Phillips later wrote that the song unfolded memory like pages soaked in blood. Others heard different things. Some swore it was a hymn sung in reverse. Some said it was two voices at once, Rachel's and someone else's. Someone younger, Elder Thompson, fell to his knees. Not in prayer, not in surrender. He clutched his chest, tears streaming down his face, as if every second of denial had finally come due. Each a needle driven through the veil of his faith, he whispered, "I watched them die." I watched and said nothing. And as if in response, a section of the floor near the altar creaked, just once, not from weight. From something beneath, Rebecca moved toward it slowly, reverently. Her fingers traced the cracks in the boards, not like a child exploring, but like someone remembering. "They were here," she said softly. "They still are," Judith Whitfield screamed. Not out of guilt, but out of recognition. "We buried them here," she cried. "We built the altar over their blood." The sound that followed wasn't wind, it wasn't even human. It was a weeping that came from below, muffled, faint, but unmistakably childlike. It didn't ask for vengeance. It didn't beg to be free. It simply wanted to be acknowledged. That's the part no one tells you about reckoning. It doesn't come like a fire. It comes like a whisper that never stops. The church was no longer a place of worship. It was a reliquary of buried betrayal. And now that betrayal had a voice. Philip stepped back, and for the first time in his life, he was afraid of the altar, but the twins. They stepped closer and smiled. The weight of silence was suffocating. No one moved. No one dared break the spell. Rebecca and Rachel stood side by side, their pale faces almost glowing in the dim light of the sanctuary. Their eyes, those unnervingly ancient eyes, held a calm that was unsettling. It was as if they were conduits, portals to a truth too heavy for the living to bear. Rebecca's voice cut through the stillness like a blade. "They didn't come here by accident," she said. "The Whitman twins were hunted because they carried knowledge, forbidden knowledge, secrets that could unravel the foundation of Pine Hollow and beyond." A murmur spread through the congregation, disbelief mingling with fear. Knowledge. Secrets? These were words that belonged to whispered legends and dark folk tales, not to the solemn walls of their church. Rachel stepped forward, her tone colder, sharper. "This place is a prison," she declared. "Not just for the living, but for the dead. The truth is chained beneath these boards, and until it is freed, the past will continue to haunt every prayer, every breath you take." The elder's knuckles whitened on the pulpit as he struggled to find words, but none came. The air thickened, charged with something intangible, a force older than the Appalachian hills themselves. Ezekiel Morrison finally spoke, his voice grave and measured. "My daughter's gift is a curse," he confessed. They glimpsed beyond the veil into shadows that men like us were never meant to see. It is a power that tears apart the fabric of reality. Eyes locked on him, the congregation sensed the unspoken truth, the heavy price of the twins' knowledge. It was no miracle. It was a burden. "Why?" Phillips asked, voice trembling. "Why reveal this now? What purpose does it serve?" Rebecca's smile was faint, enigmatic. "To awaken," she said simply. "To break the cycle of silence and lies. To shine light on the darkness your ancestors buried." She paused, then added with chilling certainty, "The same darkness that will consume you all if you don't face it." The room felt colder. The wind outside howled, echoing their dread. They were standing on the edge of a revelation that could shatter everything they believed about faith, family, and the forces that govern life and death, and the twins were the keys. What secret was locked beneath the church's floorboards? What ancient corruption awaited discovery? The answer would tear Pine Hollow apart, but before that unraveling we must descend deeper. Prepare yourself. The truth lurking beneath Pine Hollow was not a secret born of mere human failing. It was a darkness forged long before the first settlers carved their homes from the Appalachian wilderness. The Whitman twins' fate was a symptom of a deeper rot, an ancient corruption threaded through the very soil of that forgotten place. Pastor Phillips, still pale from the twin revelations, found himself drawn to the floorboards beneath the altar, those silent witnesses to the church's unspoken horrors. His fingers traced the rough wood, heart pounding with dread. He had to know what was buried beneath his sanctuary, concealed from sight, but not from the twins' piercing gaze. The congregation hesitated, caught between piety and fear, as Ezekiel Morrison's voice filled the quiet space. In the darkest corners of human history, he said, there exist forces that manipulate from the shadows, powers that demand secrecy, sacrifices, and obedience. The church, meant to be a refuge, sometimes becomes a cage, a tool wielded by those who serve these hidden masters. The assembled faces shifted uneasily. Such words sounded like heresy, yet they carried a chilling weight. Rebecca's voice sliced through the tension. The Whitman twins carried the burden of a secret that threatened those powers. They knew truths that shattered the illusions of safety and control, and because of that knowledge, they were silenced. Rachel nodded, eyes dark pools of sorrow and warning, silenced but not erased. The pastor's journal, the one found, decades later, contained fragmented accounts of strange sounds in the night, unexplainable cold spots, and flickers of shadow in the corners of rooms. The townsfolk had buried these stories along with the bodies, but such darkness does not stay. Buried, Phillips swallowed hard. The weight of this knowledge threatened to break him. He realized that the church's foundation was more than timber and stone. It was laid upon fear, silence, and a pact with unseen powers. Ezekiel's eyes bore into the congregation. Every community has its skeletons. Pine Hollows just happened to be alive. The twins' revelations were not mere curiosities. They were warnings, messages from a place beyond the veil. The past had claws, and they dug deep, threatening to pull the living into an abyss of corruption and control. But there was more. Much more. Rebecca and Rachel's knowledge was not limited to Pine Hollow. Their insight spanned time and place, tapping into a web of dark history where elites, institutions, and secret societies twisted truth to maintain power. To understand this, one must first see the world not as it appears, but as it is beneath the surface. And that is the descent that begins now, because the secrets the twins revealed in that small Kentucky church echo far beyond the mountains, touching the roots of power, manipulation, and human consciousness itself. We are about to cross that threshold. The weight of the Morrison twins' revelations pressed down on Pine Hollow like a suffocating fog. As the congregation sat in stunned silence, Pastor Phillips struggled to keep his composure. He had spent years shepherding this small community, protecting it from worldly corruption and internal strife. Now, everything he thought he knew was unraveling before his very eyes, unraveling because of two 9-year-old girls, Rebecca and Rachel, did not merely speak of distant tragedies or forgotten secrets. Their words struck at the core of every hidden fracture in the community's foundation. Every whispered denial, every carefully maintained lie, every unspoken shame surfaced like dark stains on pristine cloth. The church, a sanctuary, was revealed to be a crypt, a silent vault holding truths too dreadful for daylight. And then Ezekiel Morrison, their father, stepped forward, not with words, but with the weight of unspoken understanding. His weathered face betrayed a solemn acceptance of what his daughters embodied. He was no stranger to spiritual warfare, nor to the burden of walking between worlds few dared to acknowledge. He knew what these girls were, vessels of forbidden knowledge, conduits for shadows that crawled beneath the surface of human reality. Your daughters, Pastor Phillips finally asked, voice trembling. How can they know what no living soul has told them? What is this gift or curse? Ezekiel's eyes darkened as he answered. It is not a gift in the way you think. It is a burden passed down through bloodlines, touched by ancient corruption secrets inherited like scars, not blessings. Rebecca and Rachel see beyond the veil because the veil was torn from their souls long before they could walk. The room grew colder, the firelight flickering as if responding to the gravity of Ezekiel's confession. Around them, the shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, elongate, as if listening. This is the legacy of Pine Hollow and places like it, Ezekiel continued. A curse woven into the fabric of human nature, institutionalized through generations of silence, lies, and fear. Those in power have always sought to suppress these truths, to keep the masses blind, docile. But the truth claws its way out eventually through dreams, through children, through the breaking of silence. Pastor Phillips looked at the twins again, innocent faces, masking eyes that bore the knowledge of the abyss. In that moment, he understood that Pine Hollow was merely a microcosm of a far darker design. A hidden system of control had threaded itself into the lives of the innocent and the guilty alike, binding souls in chains forged by fear and deception. He swallowed hard, realizing that what the Morrisons exposed was not just a local mystery, but a reflection of a universal, timeless struggle, the battle between hidden corruption and the awakening of forbidden knowledge. The kind of knowledge that, once known, changes a man forever, and the twins were its unwilling heralds. The morning after the revelation, Pine Hollow felt fractured, like a cracked mirror reflecting fractured truths in every shard. The townsfolk moved with hesitant steps, exchanging wary glances, their whispers weaving a tapestry of suspicion and fear. No one could shake the shadow that had settled over the town, as if the air itself carried the weight of the Morrison twins' words. Pastor Phillips sat alone in the church study, the heavy tome of Old Town records open before him. His fingers traced the faded ink of names long forgotten, names that now carried new meaning in light of Ezekiel's confession. The lineage of Pine Hollow was stained with secrets, accusations of occult practices, strange disappearances, and unexplained tragedies. Buried under layers of carefully crafted piety, he looked up as a soft knock echoed through the heavy wooden door. Rebecca and Rachel stood there, faces solemn yet unyielding. "Pastor," Rebecca said quietly, "there's more we need to show you." Curiosity mixed with dread in Phillips's chest as he followed the twins outside. They led him through the dense woods behind the church to a clearing bathed in pale morning light. There, hidden beneath moss and leaves, was a rusted metal box, ancient, almost alive with a pulse only the twins seemed to sense. Rachel knelt and carefully pried the box open. Inside lay a collection of brittle papers, strange symbols scrawled in the margins, and a small weathered pendant shaped like an eye. "These," Rachel whispered, "are the keys to what's been kept from us, the rituals, the warnings, the history of the curse." Pastor Phillips's breath hitched. "Where did you find this?" "In the roots of the oldest tree in Pine Hollow," Rebecca said. "The one Ezekiel showed us in a dream." Ezekiel's voice came from behind them, steady and resolute. "The tree marks the boundary between the known and the hidden. What we've uncovered isn't just a story, it's a map. A guide to understanding the forces that have shaped this town and maybe how to break free." The pastor's mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and invisible, were now assembling into a terrifying picture. They faced not just the legacy of their ancestors, but a living, breathing darkness that had thrived in the silence. "We have to be careful," Phillips said. "What we're dealing with isn't just history, it's alive, and it's watching." Rebecca nodded, her eyes fierce. "We're ready, we have to be." The dawn light crept through the trees, casting long shadows behind them. Pine Hollow's story was far from over, it had only just begun to unravel.